Now joined by Dr. Nzimande, who is the Science and Innovation Minister. Dr. Nzimande, a very good afternoon to you. Thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it. In my head, I was going through members of that Education Portfolio Committee, and you were chair, and I still remember the conversations in Parliament as all of you were trying to shape the education sector at the time. What would you say about this man as you had to play that oversight role as the committee in the formative years, of course, of this democracy? Please unmute.
Sorry for you, it's my mistake. Good afternoon to you, as well as your viewers and the listeners, and thanks for this opportunity. Well, your memory seems to be very good. I forget, by the way, we were together at around that time with yourself as a younger journalist and myself as a younger MP. Firstly, let me just start on a personal level, because I don't only think of Professor Bengu as a luminary, prominent person only, but also someone, just to start with, who also touched my own world in a deeply personal way. For instance, in 1977, September, I was losing my place at university because I was owing 100 Rand in my university fees, which wasn't a small amount of money because the total fees were just over 400 Rand. He gave me a loan for the first time to pay that 100 Rand so that I could continue. Otherwise, I wouldn't have continued with my university education at all. Sometimes I reflect and say, well, maybe those were the beginnings of NSFAS, because Professor Bengu at the time was the dean of students at the University of Zululand. He had connections with the church. I think that's how we managed to raise that money. I did pay it back, by the way, when I was working that 100 Rand. So it's someone who really cared, genuinely and in an honest way. He was a gentleman also. I'm told, by the way, my wife was a student under him at Dlangezo High School and also was a head girl. She says Bengu used never to lose the stick, but the moment he appears, everyone will be to attention. He had that dignity to himself. That's very important, by the way, for leaders at this point in time. I don't need to overemphasize that. That we are modest, we are humble, and we relate to people in a respectful way. But of course, I worked with him more when I was chairperson of the Portfolio Committee. You are right. Some of the people who were there was Umam Naledi Pando, the late Shepherd Mdladlane, Ishmael Vadi, James Masego, if I'm thinking of the ANC study group, and of course, Ubam Pontane, there was Mike Ellis from the Democratic Party then. We were navigating a very complicated but exciting period at the same time, because we were trying to put together about 19 different education departments into a single department, 21 universities that were racially based and racially fragmented. Professor Bengu led with legislation that laid the foundation to bring all that into a single education system with lots of opposition, by the way. And I laugh now when I look at the Bella Bill, because it's revisiting the debates we had at that time, because the National Party and other white opposition parties were wanting Afrikaans to be retained, not because they wanted to promote Afrikaans as a mother tongue language, but they wanted to have schools that would actually exclude black children using language. Professor Bengu was a gentleman, but he was very firm and committed when it actually comes to transformation. By the way, he's the one who changed the Tertiary Education Fund of South Africa, which you may still remember, into now the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. Gave it a law, which is the NSFAS Act, which is still there till today. In fact, I would argue that the fact that NSFAS today is billions of rands It started as TEFSA even before 1994 at the insistence of former President Mandela. Without that foundation, we wouldn't be supporting the more than 1 million students that are being supported today. So I have enormous respect for Professor Bengu. Also, just as Minister of Science, Professor Bengu was a founding principal of Hlangezo High School, which is one of the most prestigious schools under apartheid, meant for black South Africans, somewhere next to University of Zululand and Epang. Was very good in maths and science, under the leadership of Professor Bengu. When he was at Fort Hare in the early 1990s, took Fort Hare into the new democratic South Africa, also very passionate about matters of science. So he was a pioneer for that reason in many other respects. The Higher Education Act that we passed in 1997, he was the one who actually came with that act, which we were steering as parliamentarians through Parliament, that set in motion the building of the post-school education and training system that has made enormous achievements since then. He's a true founding father of our democracy. By all means, there is no doubt about that. And as I say, a very modest person who actually made a huge contribution. Of course, I've also honored him, though I was also honored when I asked him to say, we have a development grant to support your former black universities, which we call historically disadvantaged institutions. We want to name that grant as Sibusiso Bengu Development Grant, which is what is being called even now. I was in higher education then. He humbly accepted it. As a matter of fact, he was even there when we launched it in Durban. And he says, Minister, saying to me, I accept this as an honor to me, but please make sure this doesn't fail. That was Professor Bengu, because he didn't want to do anything that was actually not going to succeed. He was saying to me, don't name this thing with my name, but then it actually fails. So he really made a huge and enormous contribution in the light of enormous opposition. Of course, it was an exciting period. We passed the Schools Act in 1996. And I also need to say, Vuyo, at that time, I was given by the ANC the task of leading negotiations on education and the drafting of the Constitution, which I adopted in 1996. So I was consulting with him quite a lot, with members of the ANC study group, on what has now become Section 29 of the Constitution, which is the education clause. I consulted a lot with Professor Bengu, and what that clause looked like today, it may have elements of compromise, but that was drafted together with the Professor Bengu. So he laid this foundation in the Constitution, even defining access with basic schooling as free education, and also commitment to progressively expand post-school education and training. And he was never, ever at any time wanting to get personal recognition for himself. I'm glad he passed away, having also visited him a couple of times over the years, and also telling him what we think of him and the role that he actually played, because it's good also to tell people whilst they are still alive on the role that they played. Allow him of you also that when you celebrate someone like Professor Bengu, at the same time must be the celebration of all the teachers. He was a good teacher for years. We must celebrate our teachers. We say to our teachers, you are doing well. Those who are still in the system and those who have retired. But I would like to pay tribute in particular, Vuyo, to those black teachers in particular, well, there were whites as well, who were teaching in the Bantu education schools, because we were meant to be de-educated. Verwoerd said, black people are not supposed to learn mathematics, because where are they supposed to use it? At university, when I was doing economics 1, our lecturer says, too many of you, 150, blacks do not understand economics. Even this black power we are shouting outside is not good for my economics. It's only good behind the spade. That was actually the attitude that we were faced with, which we actually had to deal with. So tribute to those teachers who made us something, what many of us are today, as professionals, as lawyers, as engineers, others, of course, as teachers, subverting what the apartheid government wanted to do with Bantu education. Professor Bengu was amongst those, and he is a symbol of all those teachers who taught under the most difficult conditions, especially under Bantu education. So a tribute to him. He was our hero, a humble, great man.
You've said it all, from the personal all the way to the professional, but also, of course, speaking to his legacy. Perhaps as a parting shot, Dr. Nzimande, speaking of the respect that people had for him, but also talking about his modesty and humility. Somewhere as you were talking, you reminded me of an episode around the time you were chairperson of the portfolio committee on education. We started seeing tensions in Parliament between MPs, especially you as chairpersons of committees and members of the executive. There was a sense that ministers at the time, Steve Tshwete was the leader of government business at the time. I remember a crisis meeting between the legislature in the form of the Speaker, Frini Jinwala, people like Bulelani Nguka, who was the deputy chairperson of the NCOP, to deal with this crisis where ministers were no longer feeling, or there was a sense among MPs, especially chairpersons of committees, that ministers had started to undermine a parliament. And Ncolosi, Professor Bengu, wasn't one of those ministers who stood accused of that.
Yes, definitely. I mean, there will always be tensions between ministers and members of parliament. I think it's inherent in the relationship. But I want to say that our relationship with Minister Bengu then, I can safely, without fear of contradiction, regard it as having been a model relationship between a chairperson of the portfolio committee and a minister. Largely also, by the way, because of a very special role that was played by Tamim Sele, who is now our ambassador in Nigeria, who was the minister's advisor at the time, who made sure that there was complete linkage and sharing of information, especially from the ministry and the department, into the portfolio committee. That's what made it our relationship to be good. I remember the opposition, we were trying to drive a wedge between myself and Professor Bengu. When we were dealing with the school's bill then, before it became an act, they say, yeah, we are dealing with two bills here. There's the Bhengu bill, which we are supporting as the opposition, but now we are drafting a Nzimande bill, which is completely different, because they were trying to drive a wedge, exploiting that sometimes there were these tensions. We made sure that we consulted each other all the time. What I liked also with Professor Bengu was that he said, Nzimande, my door is open. Whenever you think that you actually need to come and share or engage me, there were sensitive things around which, for instance, we could disagree. But in my case, we never took those publicly in a manner that actually would indicate that there was a tension between a minister and the chairperson. Well, there are still those tensions now. I hope that with experience, we'll be able to deal with those better as our democracy matures. I respected Ncolosi as a minister and the role that he was playing. He also respected my role, by the way, as chairperson of the portfolio committee. And we're navigating very complex. In fact, the opposition was very active. They were even sometimes boycotting my meetings in the middle of the meeting. They will say, we disagree with you, Chair. We are so biased. You don't even want to listen to us, which wasn't true. Then they would walk out. The schools bill, they walked out, hoping that they will undermine it. Remember, that's one day I said in Parliament, we will pass this legislation even if we sit on Christmas Day here in Parliament. Because they were actually trying all sorts of tricks to also drive a wedge between myself. I also want to thank Tamim Sele, by the way, for the role that he played as a conduit sometimes between the minister. Not that I couldn't go and meet with the minister, but between the ANC study group, the portfolio committee, and the minister.
Dr. Nzimande, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Vuyo.
The Minister of Science and Technology, paying tribute to Professor Sibusiso Bengu, the very first Minister of Education in democratic South Africa. He will be buried tomorrow. Dr. Nzimande was, of course, the chairperson of the Education Portfolio Committee at the time that Professor Bengu was Minister.